Welcome to the Past Precedent. It's the 30th century BCE and writing is invented. What's the date specifically? Well, aside from choosing the one source that said that's when writing was invented, I like the date because it seems like writing before 3000 BCE was developing into a writing system. Then after 3000 BCE, it was more sophisticated and widespread. And I also like the date because it's the date that historians have often used when hieroglyphs, the hieratic script, and papyrus were invented. So at 3000 BCE, we have the two primary cornerstones of Western civilization writing down their thoughts that still affect us today. And for our purposes of building an effective timeline, if you plug in writing is invented 30th century BCE, you'll have your third date. There seems to be two schools of thought that I've come across. One, writing was invented 5 times independently around the world, and 2, it was invented once, then everyone else borrowed it. On one hand, when we compare the early writing systems of Crete, China, Mesoamerica, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, we find that none of these writing scripts have the kinds of similarities seen between truly related scripts, whereas all other scripts appear to have been borrowed from one of these 5. On the other hand, there's the monogenesis argument. It states that in Sumer, there's evidence of writing evolving, and in all other places, it just appeared in a more developed form, which suggests that the idea was borrowed. As Professor Fischer put it in his book, A History of Writing, most scholars still prefer to believe that writing originated independently in many regions of the world, as an expression of a society having attained an advanced level of civilization. However, writing is not an automatic reward of social sophistication. Writing must be elaborated, and this entails a protracted process determined by evolving social needs. Drawing from a standardized repertoire of pictograms and symbols, the long development from notches to tablets, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia elaborated what has since become humankind's most versatile tool. All other writing systems and scripts are perhaps derivatives of this one original idea, systemic phoneticism. In Sumer, we see this development beginning around roughly 3500 BCE, with tokens, cylinder seals, and cuneiform tablets, keeping track of food and goods with pictograms and tally marks of a base 10 system. From here, pictograms soon began to represent sound rather than the actual picture, allowing new words and names to be written. For instance, if we take the English word I, we could draw a picture of it to represent it. But there's also the first person pronoun I, and they sound the same. So you could draw I whenever you want to represent the sound I. Then either context or additional symbols could be used to clarify the intended word. This is what scholars call the Rebus principle. Scholars seem to cite this principle as a major step when moving from pictograms to phonetic writing, and they credit the Sumerians for this contribution to humankind. So as we enter the Proto-Literate period, there were about 2,000 symbols used by Sumerian scribes, but they weren't able to express tense or mood or complete sentences. Over the next 500 years, due to both the desire for efficiency and the increased reliability of phonetic writing, symbols become more abstract, and the number of symbols in the Sumerian writing system are reduced to around 800. An exclusive phonetic writing system did not fully develop in Mesopotamia until about 2500 BCE, when it finally could convey any and all thought. This is probably when the earliest Sumerian literature was written. Also by this time, the Sumerian neighbors to the north, the Akkadians, adopted the Sumerian cuneiform script and applied it to their own language. Just like how the languages of the modern West, like English, Spanish, German, and French, applied the Latin script to their languages. That's why, despite all the variations in the sounds of these languages, most of the symbols in each of these scripts look similar, whereas the Chinese language uses its own script and therefore looks and is completely different. Eventually, the Akkadian language took over. It would become the lingua franca of international communications in the ancient Near East. Kings in this area, even the pharaohs of Egypt, would write to one another in Akkadian. And it's from the abundance of Akkadian cuneiform scripts, which was also adopted by the Babylonians, that were able to decipher and read Sumerian. The Akkadians and Babylonians revered the Sumerian language as their religious and cultural language, so in their scribal schools, they had to learn Sumerian. As Professor Fischer put it, nearly all the literature that we have in Sumerian derives from the tablets written by young Babylonian scribal apprentices. Altogether, 14 other languages in the ancient Near East adopted the Sumerian cuneiform script, and this script was in use until roughly the 1st century CE. In Egypt, their pictograms, which we call hieroglyphs, seem to emerge with that Rebus principle already applied to their symbols by 3000 BCE. The lack of evidence of writing developing in Egypt is why scholars argue if it was invented independently by the Egyptians, or if it was introduced to them by the Sumerians through trade. And instead of using cuneiform script directly, they were just inspired by it and used new symbols or traditional symbols to accommodate their language. To Egyptians, their myths say that writing was invented by the god Thoth, who was also the god of wisdom, magic, and he recorded the conduct of every person brought to the Hall of the Dead for judgment. Hieroglyphs literally means sacred carving in Greek, so it was perceived to be the language of the gods and used for ceremonial purposes only, and not used to keep track of mundane stuff like food and goods. As a result, their writing system was more stagnant and not allowed to evolve like it did in Sumer. The Sumerians also believed that writing was invented by a god, but I guess it wasn't as sacred since the writing was allowed to evolve and change over time. For practical commonplace documents and literary texts, Egyptians used another script called hieratic, or cursive hieroglyphs, using ink on papyrus, and it seems to have been in use around the same time as hieroglyphs. Then by the 7th century BCE, due to regional inconsistencies, the hieratic script was replaced by the Demotic script, which was also used for the same commonplace purposes as hieratic. The Demotic script was used up until the 5th century CE, and it survived just a bit longer than hieroglyphs. But we're not done yet. After 7 centuries of Greek influence in Egypt, around the 4th century CE, the Egyptian language adopted the Greek script, which we call Coptic, and that was used until the 7th century CE when Islam and the Arabic language took over the area. So at that point, with the exception of the members within the Coptic Christian Church, the Egyptian scripts and the language mostly remained buried in history until Champollion deciphered hieroglyphs in 1822 CE. His knowledge of Coptic catalyzed his eureka moment that allowed him to decipher hieroglyphs written on the Rosetta Stone.